essentially like a narrative, historically speaking, and not a year-by-year basis, but an age-by-age basis. Each major event just happens, which will help us understand conflicts greater. And of course, if you want to ask questions at the end, you can. So we start off obviously looking at a context where exactly the region we're looking at is. And of course it is the Middle East, the heart of political conflicts in the world today. We zoom in with my amazing custom animation. We look at the region in more detail. So the area we're looking at now is here, which is Israel and Palestine as it's known as now. Before we look into that, we need to look at the surrounding regions. You've got Egypt to the south, you've got Jordan, you've got Turkey, and you've got Lebanon to the north, which is very important. Now when we look at the actual issues, we can understand where what's happening is happening. We go further, we can look at the time now. At the moment, this is how it stands. You've got Israel, which is this white area here, and you've got Gaza and the West Bank and the Golan Heights, which are technically part of what's known as Palestinian occupied territory. They're not like a state, and neither are they non-existent. They're kind of in leeway. And Israel is currently occupying them under its mandate, its right to rule. And to understand why this is the case, we have to go back in history and look at why it started. And technically speaking, you could go back pretty far back. You could go back to the Crusades, go back to the times of the prophets and all sorts of things. But to be relevant and look at the current conflict, we should go back to the year 1897. This is Theodor Herzl. He is a man who, in 1896, he wrote a pamphlet. He's a German lawmaker and academic. And he wrote a pamphlet called The Jewish State. And in it, he gave the religious and the political reasons to establish a Jewish state on earth. There was none at the time. And he cited the land of Palestine, as it was known, as the very place to do this. The very orchestrator of what we now know as Zionism comes from him. And he created the World Zionist Organization. This word Zionism and Zionist will come up constantly in this talk, so you should know what it means. It is a political wing of Judaism which compels that Jewish people, sometimes every Jewish person, returns to what is seen as their cultural and historical homeland, which is the area of Palestine. So there is a bond created by many Jewish people to this particular land, which helps us understand it further. Now, as we understand, before there was any Jewish state, before there was any Israel, there was a land called Palestine. In it there lived Muslims, Christians, Jewish people, Zoroastrians, various tribes and peoples, in relative peace. I mean, these are religious peoples, they do fight occasionally, but they tended to have a larger level of peace than you would assume. And also, Jewish people lived there to a great number. In 1909, you found a large number of Jewish people from Russia moving away from Eastern Europe where they faced persecution to Palestine, which is ironic, considering Palestine was a Muslim-dominated area, and people who had been persecuted by Europeans had found Muslims as the place for safety. Also in the same year, Tel Aviv, the first Jewish town, was established. Jewish people who had collected and joined in certain major places, and this is the first time they established a town for themselves. In 1916 is where it starts to get a bit more interesting. You have the Sykes-Picot Agreement. As we know, back in the time, it was the colonial age, so you had Britain and France governing most of the Middle East. Because of various conflicts, Sykes-Picot, two French and British decided to redraw the map of the Middle East, according to British and French rule. They essentially split it in half, this region. A belonging to the French and B belonging to the British. And so we find that they had redrawn the map in such a way it would split up the current existing tribes the way they were made, and also it cut into the heart of Israel, to the heart of Palestine at the time. Now, go to the next slide. We find that if any of you have seen the film Lawrence of Arabia, any of you, it's a very famous film, you find that in order to achieve this split between the lands, the French and the British had to convince the Arabs, the Arab tribes who lived there, that if you give us power over this region, you will still retain power over your individual areas. For example, if a tribe lives in South Lebanon, the Picot told them that you live under French rule, but you can still choose how to live your life. However, as I mentioned, there was an existing World Zionist Organization, a collection of individuals, academics, lecturers, and politicians who were committed to creating in the future a Jewish state. And so in 1917, go like this, in 1917 we had the Balfour Declaration. You see, the year before, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British and the French promised, they promised this land to Arabs under European rule. And a year later, questions at the end. A year later, immediately, the Balfour Declaration states that there was to be a Jewish state in place. In other words, 1 year they said this is all for Arabs under European rule, and the next year they said it's entirely Jewish rule, the same piece of land, which is where the conflict begins. In 1920 to 1948, Britain rules Palestine. They get the mandate, they get government position, they get royal assent, they are allowed to rule the nation. And this is where, from my personal understanding, the conflict truly takes off. We had a number of conflicts as soon as this happened. In 1920, there was a conflict, there was riots between Jewish and Arab farmers and workers, leading to hundreds of deaths. Because of the mass influx of Jewish immigration, and it was done in such a way in which it inhabited economic growth for the Arabs at the time. In 1929, you had started to have religious warfare. In Jerusalem, one of the most important and iconic cities for all theists, for all Abrahamic theists, be it Christian, Muslim or Jewish, because of the way the Jewish people had started to settle in that region, and because of the support they were given by existing British troops, the Arabs saw this as a threat to their way of life, affected the way of life their fathers had lived, and also affected their continuation, their longevity. And in 1936, we saw a large uprising, usually overlooked, but it did happen. A anti-colonialist uprising by the Palestinian people. You find during British colonial rule, many say, and the people I'm sure in this room who love this fact, that the British Empire was so large it covered a third of the world, or a quarter of humanity, or the sun never sets in the British Empire. Well, the reason that's not the case now is because many nations started to have revolutions and fight against colonial rule. In 1936, the Palestinian people did just that. And before we look at what happened after, we should remember there was a movement to free Palestine from British rule and give it, and there was at least some potential leeway for it to be a Jewish Arab state at this point. But that all changes now. See, in 1947, Britain decided this land is too large or too conflicted for us to rule. A number of factors indicated that they went to the UN and said, can you partition this land? The UN did that, and as you can see, the yellow area indicates the Arab nation, and the orange indicates the Jewish nation. So you find that they had created a separation between the two states, the beginning of the two-state solution. And in 1948, Israel was formally called the Jewish state. First time it ever happened, ever, an internationally recognized Jewish state. And this is where we found the beginning of the Arab and Israeli conflicts. What we have now comes from, it's a chain of events from then. You see, as soon as this happened, the Arab tribes, the Christians and the Muslims, mainly Muslims, but also a number of tribes, decided this was against the agreement they had with the Europeans, it was against their way of life, it was against everything which had supported their current existence in the region. So you had a simultaneous revolt by Arabs all around the region, from the south, from Egypt, from Gaza, you had from Lebanon, you had from Syria, you had from everywhere that there were Arabs, they started to fight against this rule. For them, they saw it as a continuation of the European rule which the British had held. And then you had two things. Number one, you had the actual war itself, where Israel fought back. Israel fought back, and they started to push the forces out of the region in which they had invaded. More than that, this is overlooked. The UN created this land. After the war, Israel pushed the forces so back they created a new partition. Think about it. All of these forces here exist in the south, and they've been pushed into this one Gaza Strip. Same with the north. All the Arabs existed were pushed into the West Bank and to the north. In other words, Israel had redrawn the map after the UN had redrawn the map. And of course, this is seen as a violation of international law. However, something else happened, something much worse in the book which I was reading. It's called the Nakba, Great Catastrophe. 700,000 individuals, Arab tribes, nomadic tribes, sporadic, lives all around the area, lives in this heartland of what was known as Palestine. The moment Israel was created, when historians went back to look, they found absolutely no trace of them. Some of them had disappeared completely. Some of them had assimilated into other tribes. Some of them, one of the reports even mentioned, didn't even understand what had happened. They'd been brainwashed to an extent. And you found this at the beginning of the catastrophe of the refugee crisis. Palestinians who believed they had the right to live in their own homes, who were forced out by international law, had no homes to go. The south wouldn't take them, the north wouldn't take them. So refugee camps started to develop at the coasts of these areas. And now, as we go from 1948 until around 2000, you have a number of major wars which we can go into. 1956 is the second Arab-Israeli war. Those of you who study history know about the Suez Canal. Egypt decided to nationalize the canal, the only passage going from the Mediterranean down to the rest of the world. The only passage, and it was blocked by Egypt. Part of their enmity to Israel was that they blocked all shipping going to Israel. All shipping. And at the moment, it's worth noting, Israel was being funded by NATO, by the United States, by Britain. They were seen as a Western state, really. But they were blocked from all carriers and shipments coming in, which led to essentially Arabs being invaded in the Egyptian peninsula. Israel went in, they freed their obviously massive military strength, they liberated the Suez Canal area and went back, and they started to gain a number of territories in the way. Next we have the third Arab-Israeli war, the occupation. 1967 is integral to our understanding of this conflict, because right now today, whenever anyone tries to be constructive, they always say, let's go back to the 1967 borders. Well, what happened in 1967? The Sinai Peninsula, which is Egypt, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were all taken under control of Israel. As we know, they weren't technically part of Israel per se under international law, but yet, due to military conflict in 1967, they were occupied by Israel. Now, the only way Israel gave up this Egyptian land was because of America. There was a series of deals between Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt, and of course the leader of Israel, so that the land would be given back. The West Bank, however, was kept under Israeli rule, as was the Gaza Strip. Two things to look at now. The Gaza Strip, this tiny piece of land here, was laid under siege by Israel. There was a blockade made. So there was no migration in and out, there was no medicine, no food, and from this period onwards you start to see a level of terrorism which develops in the region, in this region. In the West Bank as well, you have the wall which is constructed a little bit later. A large wall going around, being built around this West Bank, separating Palestinians from Israelis at the time. And this also led to an escalation of Islamic terrorism in the region. Groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, groups like Hamas in the south, groups like Fatah. All these groups started to gain more and more public support because of how radical their objectives were and how seen as important they were by the Palestinian people. We move on now to the fourth Arab-Israeli war, the 6-Day War. Very interesting. What happened was, during a period of time, the Israelis noticed that in Egypt there was being military mobilization. So they decided that now was the right time to attack. They attacked the south, as well as the north and the east, and the south and the west. And you find then that this led to a massive humiliation of the Arabs. The fact that they were defeated at such a great strength by the Israelis led them to retaliate. They started what was known as the Yom Kippur War, a Jewish holiday, an important event, on which the Arabs invaded, a bilateral invasion from all the areas they tried to invade Israel. And they failed. It took about 10 days, 12 days for Israel to become mobilized, and once they did, they drove them out completely. And they gained even more and more control in the north, in this area here, which is Lebanon. And Lebanon is unique for a number of reasons, and we're about to go on to them. Now, 1982, the Lebanon War. You should know in Lebanon is a large proportion of Christians, of Muslims who are Sunnis and Muslims who are Shias. It's a very diverse area, arguably not as diverse as Syria, but close to as diverse. And in 1982, Israel noticed that this area of South Lebanon could become a potential extension of Israel. If we go thinking back of Theodor Herzl, who wrote The Jewish State, the state he drew was much, much larger than what we've been looking at. It was much larger. It wasn't just confined between the sea and the river, it wasn't confined between the north and the south, it was a much larger area in the region. And so they decided to invade Lebanon and to try and get out all of the Syrian influence in Lebanon. Essentially, the Israelis were trying to break the alliances between Arabs. We look at divide and conquer, it was a similar principle. Whilst doing that, they defeated the Syrians, but they did not defeat the Lebanese. And they started to breed, they started to inspire a very strong Lebanese resistance, which would come back and bite them pretty hard. Because right now, the Israelis had not suffered technically a single land defeat, be it troops or in the air, as well as the air or naval. Israel hadn't lost. They had superior power, technology, but now they started to inspire a new wave of opposition, which we'll look at in a moment. Now, you had in 1987 the Intifada, the uprising. There was a number of things. This was a moment where the Palestinian people, as a collection of Arabs, decided that if there's any high time to attack, if there's any one time to break this struggle that they felt they were under, it's this time. The first was in 1987. We had a number of groups together formed, marching out of their towns towards Israeli towns, or sometimes Islamic terrorism as well. I don't know using that terminology, but it's worth understanding that these groups who were terrorists claimed some sort of Islamic inspiration. You ask me later, I'll try and refute that, but they do. And they tried to uprise and launch a resistance which would tackle the major cities, but of course, as we know, the Israeli military was far superior. At the time, really, the Palestinian people were sometimes a group of young people throwing stones, all that kind of thing. You've seen the pictures. They weren't a unified body unless they were terrorists. Next. Now, a strange thing happened in 1993. Something never happened ever before. A level of optimism and a level of peace. The Oslo Accord. Outside the White House, you have Bill Clinton, you have Yasser Arafat, the leader of Palestine at the time, and you have President Reuven of Israel. The first time the leaders had come together openly, internationally, and shook hands and shown any sign of peace. If you look at the years 1993, we've essentially gone through the whole 20th century, and it's the only one time there was an even hint that there could be a level of peace. And it was optimistic. The Israelis started to come out of the West Bank, which was internationally occupied and illegal. They started to ease the blockade on the Gaza Strip. There started to be better relations and less terrorist activities. However, it wasn't to last because in 2000, we had the second intifada. The Gaza Strip, I mentioned, is very important. It's essentially a very small piece of land. I don't know how big, maybe the size of Croydon. I don't know, probably, I don't know, it's tiny. And it's covered by military personnel of Israel. Many people look at it and say this is a concentration camp of Israel to the Palestinians. They use this emotive language because if you see the pictures of the Gaza Strip, you see the way in which it's covered. You think, well, what is the difference between this and a very large prison? Also, before 2000, very important, there are reports of chemical attacks on the people of the Gaza Strip by Israel. It's seen as a testing ground for a number of, they had white phosphorus, you also had certain military programs which were done, air programs which were done by Israel in this region. And it all built up until 2000 when Hamas, the terrorist leadership of Gaza, said no more. They started to launch rockets and missiles into the region, which was of course suppressed greatly by the Israeli Defense Force. Now you have 2006, something which has never ever happened ever in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Israel lost a land battle. They went to South Lebanon, which was north of Israel, to try and claim more and more of the land, or they argued to reclaim some of the land. However, between the other Lebanon war and this war, Lebanon, the south of Lebanon, had become mobilized. They'd realized that if they're going to be the resistance, they're going to have to do it properly. And the group Hezbollah formed. They were an Islamic group, and also a group which argued the resistance of not only Lebanon, but Palestine. They say Israel went in 2006 with something close to 10,000 to 30,000 forces on the ground, as well as not in the ocean because it was inconvenient and because of the blockade, but also because it was the way they wanted to win the war was to gain the territory, land territory. They had up to 10 to 30,000 forces. Hezbollah had a number of hundreds, and because of their far superior strategic ability and tactical menace, they managed to drive out not only Israel from the south of Lebanon, but so far back that they were completely out of Lebanese territory. Something that had never happened for decades. Israel had essentially been taken almost completely out of a region which it had occupied in the past. This was the beginning, well not the beginning, this was the epitomes of the resistance to Israel. There was non-suicidal operations, but it was a military battle. And now we come to more recent times. 2008, the Gaza War. You may have remembered this. What happened was the Gaza Strip, which had been under siege many a time, was attacked by Israel. But it started because the Gaza Strip, the people of them, attacked Israel. So you can see in many different periods of this battle, either one attacks the other or the other attacks the one. In this particular case, it was both of them. Rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip, and Israel decided to retaliate in brute force by essentially destroying all of the forces, the naval forces, everything, not naval forces, the air forces which were at the coast. In 2011, a few years ago, something very odd happened. Mahmoud Abbas, was a very cool surname, he went to the UN and he decided that he would submit Palestinian statehood request. He went to all of Palestine, he united all of the power factions and said, I will go to the UN and I'll represent you. He wrote a document, he sent it to the UN, and he got almost half of the UN General Security Council to approve it. However, it wasn't approved in the end. In the end, what happened was Palestine became recognized as a non-member state of the UN, which is a great big deal looking at how it was in the past. It had become a new age recently of Palestinian statehood, a new international effort. And also one finds that Palestine joined UNESCO, something I wasn't going to mention but I will mention. UNESCO is the United Nations Cultural Heritage Society. Palestine joined in 2011. As soon as they joined, America withdrew all funding from UNESCO. And Israel started to reopen its settlements, building settlements on the West Bank, which is important because you can look at it here. Right now, you have two occupied territories. You have the Gaza Strip and you have the West Bank. The Gaza Strip is constantly in and out of blockade. This is a very famous, it's very small, I'm sorry, but a very famous picture of a young man throwing a stone at the tanks, and it's used to symbolise the difference in force. It's like bringing a knife to a snowball fight. You have a group of Palestinians who are essentially at a very weak level of strength, and you have Israelis who have a great amount of funding. And then you have the West Bank, and this is the most controversial current thing which Israel are doing. Because when you look at pictures like this, you look at this massive wall, and on the other side are Israelis and this side are Palestinians. And you look at this, I don't know if you can see in this light, the barbed wire. You look at the caging. You think of the Holocaust. You think of that kind of state in which a nation is oppressing the other one in that way. Palestinian terrorism in other regions. In this region, these are farmers, these are students, these are workers, these are teachers. And you raise the question, what lessons have Israel learned from the Holocaust? If it's said that Israel is part of the Holocaust, if they act this way to the Palestinian people. Putting in context everything I've said, we can look at the whole series of events in this way. 1947, you've got this, the partition by the UN we've discussed. Before that, green is Arab, by the way, white is Israel. You've got majority Arab. Over time, the Israelis start to get the UN resolutions in their favour, they start to get international law going in their favour, and at this point, in 1967, they control this parts of the Palestinian region, and these parts are Palestinian. Recently, however, we've seen two things. Number one, this area here. I'm sorry, it's not a very big picture, but this region is a large kind of chunk of Arab homeland. All of those people were squeezed or were led into this region. And here you find a settlement building began. Settlements in the West Bank at places of strategic importance, places with water, places with high ground, places which had a good basis for a civilization, were built upon by Israelis in Palestinian territory. And now you find there's a mix of Israelis and Palestinians living in one very small region, which is why it's a constantly volatile area, and which is why when we look at the issue, and when we think of the issue, we cannot ignore looking at that, and that before we look at this today. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, please do ask.
So what's your solution to the problem in the present day?
I used to think that you could have a two-state solution, like one half Israel, one half Palestine, you share. But because of the way in which the two people have reacted and treated each other over decades, I don't understand how that could be a sustainable path. For example, if today that UN request in 2011 went through, and we had two states, Israel, Palestine, I don't think you'd see an end to peace. I think you'd see an end to the current expansion, but the anger, the peace, and the historical hatred will still exist. My solution, a bit more idealised, is one state. I don't call it Israel. Now that I've finished, I can tell you I detest the Israelis. I don't know if you can tell in my presentation. I hope you didn't. That would ruin my impartiality. But the region, I think, have acted in a very negative way, and I would see the only way of having peace is having an end to that particular occupation. I do think that, yeah, you are right. You can't. If you're going to have a solution, they've got to work together. It's up to us to decide what balance of power we see fit. I see that.
Would you say the United States are a large part of the reason why Israel has continued to expand its influence?
Most definitely. Because if you look at 1948, when Israel was created, the amount of funding which was put in by America was massive. And also, more than that, if you look at on the map, Egypt and Israel, there used to be a lot of conflict, and that was sorted out and stopped by America. Now, one would say that's a good thing. America has helped to ease the fire. But what they also did was promise that the Gaza, which is connected to Egypt, would not be opened. That avenue of trade, of commerce, of medicine was blocked by the American ruling, which happened in the 80s. And I think America's played a very dangerous game in the Middle East because they've supported Israel categorically. And they've also spoken about democracy and peace in other nations. And I fail to understand how you can talk about those things when you are funding, essentially, the Israeli Defense Force, which is limiting that peace which you speak of. So my personal opinion, Sadi, is that America's played a deeply hypocritical role unless they are openly, out-and-out pro-Israel and anti-Palestinian, which they have failed to do till now. So I see that as a very two-faced approach.
How many international laws has Israel broken in regards to Palestine?
And
also, why hasn't the international community done anything about it?
Right, I'll answer the first one first. Israel treaties broke. I read 132 for the West Bank. I think there's more for the Gaza Strip as well. There are quite a lot of treaties that broke up. Why has nothing been done? Good question. The Israeli International Lobby, that original in 1897, that international Zionist organization I spoke about, exists today in the form of a lobby. Internationally, in every level of society, especially the high level of society, you have people who are committed to the Jewish state under all circumstances. Under any situation, they will support Israel in any case, and they have managed to infiltrate and become extremely powerful in politics. Some people see this as conspiracy and say, well, Jews run the politics, Jews run the media. I don't think that's the case. I rather think that because of the strategic importance of Israel, it's too valuable and precious for powers like America and Britain to simply give up or leave to their own devices. So my personal opinion, the reason of that is because they're too important, because they've become so embedded in our political culture?
Two questions first. Is Jerusalem anywhere there?
Jerusalem is that's the heart, that is Jerusalem.
Okay,
Well,
good.
it's just there actually, but that's where
Okay.
it's
Secondly, if going back to the time America supported Israel, that America actually supported Palestine, do you think Palestine would not have done the same thing Israel have done in time trying to expand?
I think then, no, now maybe. Because then, there wasn't, you know, the Israeli kind of quest for homeland, that Zionist movement. That was a very strong movement, which was supported by America. The Palestinians didn't have that. They didn't have that much of a religious connection. Sure, there's religious sites, but they didn't have that. They had essentially homes and farms and villages. So I think they would have kept their land, but there was less of a need for them to be so military in their action, from my understanding. What was your second question? Oh, I already answered. Yeah, right. So yeah, Nick.
How does the voting system work in Israel? Because I often see it finishes with a coalition. So how does that work
from
out?
what I understand of it,
So
yeah, Mr. Marlow can explain this later if you can, but from what I understand, it is seen as a democracy and there are votes. But there's a coalition mainly because the Shas party and other not orthodox, I don't call them orthodox Jewish, that's offensive, more kind of pro-Zionist lobby, extreme Jewish parties like that, gain a level of support from the people based on kind of the religious appeal they have. And so they do seem to get a large amount of support. Netanyahu, the current leader of this place, he represents. I think he's got a tough job because he represents, like in the election, he's supposed to represent all the people, right? But he is influenced and he is essentially made by that kind of religious faction as well. And so the elections work. They claim to be democratic, but because of the coalitions you mentioned, I think it's very rare that the Israeli people get what they vote for.
So you're saying it's set up in favour of the Israelis and not the Palestinians?
No, because I might get shot after this if I say that. What I would say is, actually, go on. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. Right, Ali.
Two questions. The first is, with the World Zionist Organisation, was it going for the expansion of Jews by religion or ethnic Jews?
Ashkenazi ethnic Jews was part of it. Jewish people who apparently lived in the region and had moved out to Europe and then moved back in, or who wanted to move back in. But like I said, the expansion was primarily political in my opinion. Because right now, from what I've seen, the most orthodox Jewish people, the rabbis, those people, oppose Israel categorically. They say it's completely against the religion of Judaism. As a believer myself, I don't like pinning a conflict on one religion, and I don't see that as a Jewish problem. I see it as a Zionist problem, and it's important that I make that distinction. Because when I say it's a Jewish state, and it's a Jewish atrocities, I think that's anti-Semitic, because Jewish people didn't do that. Zionists politically did it, so from my understanding, it's all caused by the political need to create a Jewish state. The Jew bit is a pretext, the Zionist bit is the heart of the conflict. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, my second question is, with regard to the World Zionist Organisation, why does so many people buy into it politically? So why is it so support?
They're really powerful. I mean, they're in America, they're very strong. In Britain, there is. I found this recently. There is they have different factions within Parliament. There's a group for the Israeli, some weird name, Group for Israel, something like that. And deputy leaders, office members of the highest ranking government officials are part of it. It's the kind of unsaid truth that we must protect Israel under all circumstances, even in Israeli elections. Elections. you can't win. Very good, thank you. You can't win the election in America if you don't do two things. Number one, appeal to the Christian minority, and number two, show your undying support for Israel. I think it's become the norm. Can we have that off the camera, please? I don't want to have that.
How much funding are the US still going to Israel?
Right. Every time I read it, it's different. I read that this is a really weird one, I think they read 100 million in the last 6 months. I don't think that's true. But there is, I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's a number of billions per year. And it's under the title of foreign aid. The majority of America's foreign aid, which goes to direct countries, goes to Israel. So they're the largest part.
Yeah, in terms of on the other side, in the present day, how much support are the Arab countries like Egypt and Lebanon, as you said, giving some support to the Palestinians?
This is quite a sad fact. The Arabs can't unite in at least this one thing. I don't want to be anti-Arab, but they have a tendency to be divided on a number of issues. And one of the things now is Palestine. The only Arabs who have given support to Palestinians undyingly are Syria and Lebanon. And this is why I think Syria is in so much turmoil now, because of their support to Israel. Egypt doesn't care, they sway with the wind, they get paid by America many times. Jordan is very open to Israel. Saudi Arabia, surprisingly, are best friends with Israel. You may not know this, but they came to be so Islamic and fundamentalist. They love Israel. The only nations which are in the region are not even Arab. It's Iran, the Persian. It's not even technically. Then any other states in the region, which tells you something about the support they have. Hudayfa.
In the current climate, there's still conflict going on, right? So,
yeah. Well, not as much as
not as much. But
yeah.
if there was a huge revolution in this climate, what kind of effects could that have on countries around Israel?
Israel possess a few tens of nuclear warheads. They're given by America. Palestine don't have that. Lebanon don't have that. Syria don't have that. Iran, we don't think they have that, but there's no evidence they do. The only opposition to this Israeli project who have nuclear weapons are Russia and China. And so from my understanding, and they do support Palestine mildly, if there was a conflict, I think it would be, the Palestine issue is the issue of all ages. In that, if this issue erupts, I think there's violence all around, everywhere, essentially, because of the factions which support Israel and Palestine. I don't think it would be a guy throwing a stone at a tank anymore. I think it would be much more violent if it truly took off, like you said. Last question. Ali, I know you've asked any other questions. Anyone have questions? Last question.
Do you think that any part of the reason why Palestine might not have gained support from the international community is because of Iran's backing them?
No, because Iran only backs them from 1979 when they had the revolution. They had tens of years before that to support them. And they didn't, as I think they should have. They did, I'm not saying they didn't, but not the kind of support which we would call, right, they support them. It was more political games. Only Iran has come out and openly as a nation done that in 1979, which led to other nations doing it. Thank you very much for listening. Very important announcement that Ryan's going to give. No, we're not. Listen. Sorry, we have a very important announcement. Ryan can give it if you want.
Yeah, I don't think the ball's working. Or is it working? We've just got, I know you guys are going to be late to registration, but we've just got
1 second.
a quick,
Forget the ball, just say it.
yeah, go for it.
George Galloway MP is coming to Wellington County Grammar School in 3 weeks. Who? George Galloway MP. Those of you who know him, if you don't know him, research it, you know he's been on. Thank you very much.